The year is 326 BCE. The Hyphasis River churns, a brown, swollen barrier cutting through the heart of the world. On the bank, the mud is deep, clinging to boots and slowing every movement. 10 years of campaigning have stripped the army down to its rawest form. Thousands of men stand in formation, but the usual rhythmic clatter of their advance is gone. They are silent. Their movements are stiff, their eyes hollowed out by a decade of dust and relentless distance. They do not look toward the horizon. They look at the ground. At the front of the line, the tension is a physical weight. The men shift their weight, their breath ragged in the humid air. They have reached the edge of their endurance, and the river before them represents more than just water. It is the final limit. Alexander stands at the very edge of the bank. He holds his sword drawn, the steel reflecting the gray, overcast sky. He does not turn to look at his men. He keeps his gaze fixed on the churning current. Behind him, the phalanx does not move. The silence stretches, taut as a bowstring, waiting for a command that the soldiers no longer wish to hear. Inside the camp, the air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of damp earth and sickness. A few paces from the main line, the tent of Coenus stood apart. It was the epicenter of the brewing rebellion, the place where the arguments for turning back had been forged in low, urgent whispers. But now, there was only a chilling stillness. Inside, the commander lay on his cot, his skin gray and slick with the sweat of a fever that had burned through him in hours. His eyes were fixed on the canvas ceiling, his lips parted as if to finish a sentence that would never be heard. The mutiny had been decapitated before it could breathe. No one came out to rally the men. No one walked the lines to organize the march toward the west. The soldiers outside hovered near the entrance, their hands gripping the tent flaps, waiting for a signal that remained buried in the mud. The fever had acted with a brutal, clinical precision. It had silenced the only man capable of challenging the king. A sudden, hollow uncertainty rippled through the ranks, replacing their resolve with a cold, paralyzing dread. The leader was gone, leaving the army adrift in a world they no longer recognized, caught between a dead commander and a living king who refused to stop. The death of Coenus left a void that the wind rushed to fill. Alexander walked through the camp, his footsteps heavy in the wet earth. He did not speak. He did not need to. He moved past the officers who had been whispering of retreat only hours before. They lowered their heads as he passed, the weight of his presence crushing the last remnants of their defiance. He reached the bank again. He stopped where the river roared against the stones. He drew his blade from his side, the metal singing against the leather. He did not face his men. He extended his arm, pointing the steel straight across the churning, brown water toward the hidden empire beyond. His gaze remained fixed on the far shore. He stood motionless, a statue of absolute, terrifying purpose. The message was clear. There would be no debate. He held the position, his arms steady, his focus ironclad. One by one, the officers behind him straightened. The soldiers in the ranks looked up, their eyes tracking the direction of the blade. The hesitation in the air broke. It did not evaporate. It was shattered by the sheer force of his intent. They looked at the river, then at his back, and finally, they bowed to the inevitable. The order rippled through the ranks, carried not by voice, but by the sudden, synchronized movement of thousands. They turned from the river and began the long trek inland. For the first hour, the air was thick, humid, and still. Then, the horizon darkened into a bruised purple. The first drop hit the dry earth with a heavy, distinct thud. Within seconds, the sky split open. A deluge hammered the ground, instantly turning the dust to slick, clinging mud. It was the monsoon. The rain did not merely fall, it lashed, obscuring the path ahead and muffling the shouts of the officers. The soldiers bowed their heads against the barrage, their boots sinking and pulling with every step. The sound was deafening, a continuous, rhythmic drumming of water on metal and leather. They marched in time with the storm, their movements becoming mechanical, stripped of individual thought. There was no room for hesitation, only the necessity of putting one foot in front of the other. The weight of the equipment, the slide of the earth, the relentless gray wall of water, all of it faded into the background. They were no longer a collection of tired men, but a singular, moving force driven by a momentum that felt as heavy and inevitable as the rain itself. Weeks of marching bled into a blur of gray rain and churned earth until the scouts finally returned. They did not ride into camp. They collapsed. 3 men, mud-streaked and trembling, reached Alexander before the main column could halt. They brought news that rippled through the leading files like a chill. The Nanda Empire was not waiting in scattered garrisons. It was massed. A wall of iron and flesh had risen across the path ahead. The scouts held up their hands to indicate the scale, their fingers shaking. 200,000 infantry, they reported, and thousands of war elephants held in reserve. The sheer volume of the enemy force turned the air cold. Alexander walked to the edge of the ridge, his eyes scanning the horizon where the rain finally began to thin. Below, the ground seemed to ripple with the movement of a massive, unseen force. The scouts described the formation, a tide of shields and spears that stretched beyond the limit of sight. It was a barrier of living steel, impenetrable and waiting. The army behind Alexander fell silent. The rhythmic marching stopped, replaced by the heavy, uneven breathing of men who had marched across a world only to find this. Alexander watched the horizon. He did not blink. The obstacle was no longer a river or a mountain. It was an empire, fully awake and standing in his way. The temptation to strike was a physical weight, but Alexander remained motionless. He stood on the forward rise, his gaze fixed on the dense, dark mass of the Nanda lines. Every officer waited for the command to advance, yet he held his hand up, signaling stillness. He spent hours mapping the enemy formation. He watched how their infantry shifted in response to the wind, how the elephants were positioned in the deep rear, and where the supply chains fed into their central camp. The Nanda commanders were waiting for him to break his own line against their wall. He refused. He sat on a dry stone, tracing patterns in the dirt with his sword tip, calculating the distance and the terrain. The air between the two armies grew heavy with the friction of held breath. No spears were thrown. No arrows darkened the sky. Instead, there was the low, persistent rumble of thousands of men waiting in the mud. Alexander turned his back to the enemy and walked toward his own command tent, his movements measured and slow. He did not look back. He knew they were watching. The standoff became a new kind of war, fought not with steel, but with patience. Every minute of silence was a move in a game of nerves, and he intended to win it. While Alexander held the line, the heart of the Nanda Empire began to rot. Inside Pataliputra, the king sat on his golden throne, but he was a prisoner of his own paranoia. He had bled his subjects dry with taxes to fund the massive host standing in the rain. Now, the city walls were quiet, not with peace, but with a cold, calculated resentment. Local princes, once sworn to the crown, met in the shadows of the lower districts. They did not speak of defending the king. They spoke of survival. They saw the foreign army as a catalyst for a new order. Small groups of men began to gather near the iron-barred gates, not to repel invaders, but to prepare the locks. They passed messages through the cracks in the masonry, signals meant for no one currently inside the palace walls. The king ordered the gates reinforced, but the artisans hammered the nails loosely, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Every hour of the standoff drained the king's authority. The infrastructure of the empire was turning against itself. As the rain continued to fall, the internal tension reached a breaking point. The guards on the ramparts no longer looked outward at the threat. They looked inward, waiting for the moment when the heavy iron bolts would finally slide back. Alexander raised his hand, and the heavy silence of the camp shattered. His cavalry commanders moved instantly. They did not charge the center. Instead, they wheeled their mounts outward, breaking into a long, sweeping arc that mirrored the curve of the river. To the Nanda scouts watching from the high ground, it looked like a retreat. The riders maintained a steady, controlled gallop, their boots rhythmic against the mud, hooves throwing up dark clods of earth. They drifted wide, stretching the line until the formation resembled a closing blade. They ignored the taunts from the Nanda front line. They focused only on the distance. As the arc widened, they cut across the rear of the Nanda supply chain, isolating the massive host from their grain wagons and water reserves. The maneuver was fluid, precise, and devoid of wasted motion. Horses snorted, steam rising into the cold air as they maintained the perfect curvature of the trap. The Nanda commanders finally realized the intent, but the arc was already complete. The cavalry halted in a single, synchronized movement, their backs to the forest, their fronts facing the now trapped empire. The path behind the Nanda line was gone. The trap had been set with surgical grace. The cavalry held the perimeter, but the center belonged to the giants. A thick, low-hanging mist had clung to the river valley all morning, muffling the sounds of the host. Suddenly, the vapor began to shred. Massive, leathery shapes emerged from the white void, one by one. These were not mere animals. They were living towers of iron and muscle. The ground began to vibrate with a rhythmic, heavy thud that traveled through the soles of the soldiers' boots. Then came the sound, a low, guttural rumble that grew into a piercing, high-pitched trumpet call echoing off the distant hills. It was a singular, terrifying noise that drowned out the wind and the rain. The beasts shifted their weight, swinging trunks that could snap a spear like a twig. They stood motionless in the clearing, a wall of gray hide and ivory. The air grew heavy with the sharp, musk-filled scent of the herd. Men in the phalanx tightened their grip on their pikes, their knuckles turning white as they stared at the looming shadows. The elephants stood as an immovable obstacle, their presence radiating a primal, overwhelming power. No one moved. The entire battlefield held its breath as the giants waited for the command to trample everything in their path. The signal was a single, sharp whistle. The cavalry did not hesitate. They drove their horses into the gaps between the grain wagons, the impact of metal meeting wood echoing across the field. Steel flashed in the gray light as they cut through the lines of porters and guards. The supply chain, stretched thin and brittle, snapped instantly under the pressure. Carts overturned, spilling grain into the wet mud. Horses reared, their hooves churning the earth as the riders pushed deeper into the enemy rear. Panic spread like fire through the dry grass. Nanda guards dropped their spears, turning to look back at the sudden, violent collapse of their logistics. They were cut off. The connection to their reserves was severed, leaving them isolated in the middle of the valley. Commanders shouted orders, but their voices were swallowed by the sound of splintering timber and the thunder of galloping hooves. The cavalry did not stop to engage the main line. They circled the debris, creating a perimeter of iron that prevented any regrouping. Every second, the supply line remained broken. The Nanda host lost its foundation. The advantage had shifted, and the panic in the rear was already rippling forward to the front ranks. The phalanx moved as one. Thousands of long pikes dipped in unison, a forest of points leveled at the center. They did not run. They walked, a slow, heavy rhythm that shook the ground. When they hit the Nanda infantry, the sound was not a clash, but a dull, wet thud. The pikes found their mark instantly. The first rank of the enemy recoiled, but the pressure from behind pushed them forward into the iron wall. It became a grinding, claustrophobic struggle. The phalanx soldiers leaned their shoulders into the shields, using their weight to drive the enemy back inch by inch. Pikes snapped and were replaced by the men standing behind, the formation never breaking, never faltering. The Nanda soldiers pressed their chests against the spear points, desperate to find a gap, but the discipline held. Every muscle in the Greek line strained against the resistance of the massed enemy. They pushed. The enemy staggered. The sound of wood splintering and metal grating against metal filled the air, a constant, abrasive roar. There was no room to swing, only the relentless, forward motion of the wall. The Nanda center buckled under the sheer mechanical weight of the advance. They were being ground into the mud, driven backward toward the river, unable to halt the iron tide. The Nanda king retreated toward the city, his guards carving a bloody path through the press of his own panicked men. He reached the massive main gate, his hand raised to signal the defenders. He shouted commands, but the men on the walls did not respond. High above, the local princes stood motionless, their gaze fixed on the broken army rather than their sovereign. One prince turned his head, signaling to the gatekeepers below. A deep, grinding sound vibrated through the stone foundations. The heavy iron-bound timbers began to swing shut. The king's men surged forward, pressing their shoulders against the closing gaps, but the weight of the mechanism was absolute. The gates met with a deafening, final boom. Massive iron bolts slid into their slots, sealing the city. The king hammered his fist against the wood, then turned back toward the approaching chaos. He was no longer a ruler within his own walls. He was a stranger locked out of his sanctuary. The princes retreated from the ramparts, leaving the city defenseless against the inevitable. Silence descended on the inner courtyard, a stark contrast to the roar of the battle outside. The trap was complete, and the city now belonged to those who held the keys. The city did not fall to a siege engine, but to the sudden vacuum of authority. Inside the walls, the Nanda garrison looked at the locked gates and dropped their weapons. They did not fight. They waited. Alexander's cavalry breached the secondary perimeter through a side postern gate, left unbarred by the palace guard. There was no grand clash. There was only the rhythmic sound of iron-shod boots on cobblestone and the flicker of torches moving through dark corridors. By midnight, the palace courtyards were filled with soldiers who had expected a long, bloody assault. Instead, they found empty halls and scattered scrolls. Fires broke out in the granaries, casting long, dancing shadows against the white limestone walls. Smoke curled into the night sky, blending with the mist rising from the river. By the time the first light of dawn touched the spires of Pataliputra, the transition was absolute. The Nanda commanders sat in the central square, hands bound, watching as the new guard took their posts. The speed of the collapse left the defenders staring at the ground, unable to process the silence where the roar of war had been only hours before. The city had changed masters before the sun reached the horizon. The sun climbed over the horizon, painting the spires of Pataliputra in blinding gold. Alexander reached the main thoroughfare, his horse stepping slowly over the discarded weapons of the Nanda garrison. His boots were thick with the red dust of the riverbanks, a layer of grit that marked the distance he had traveled from the Mediterranean to the Ganges. He stopped his mount at the threshold of the central plaza. Silence hung over the city, heavy and expectant. He looked up at the towering architecture, the intricate carvings of the gates, and the vast scale of the wealth that lay before him. There was no resistance left to break. He signaled his men to halt. He dismounted, the sound of his metal greaves clinking against the stone pavement, echoing in the stillness. He walked forward, alone, toward the heart of the palace district. Each step left a clean mark in the dust of the city, a physical record of his arrival at the furthest edge of his ambition. He stood there for a long moment, breathing in the scent of incense and damp earth. watching the city wake up to a new ruler. The map of the world had reached its final, jagged point of extension. He stepped through the inner archway, and the city was his. The torches were extinguished before they could touch the tapestries. Alexander walked through the grand hall, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. But he did not draw it. He stopped before the rows of stone pillars, turning to his officers with a sharp, singular command to stand down. The soldiers hesitated, their hands still gripping their spears, but they moved back into the shadows of the colonnade. Alexander gestured toward the far end of the hall, where the elders of the city sat on the floor, watching him with eyes hardened by decades of political survival. He did not issue a decree. He walked to the center of the room and motioned for the heavy wooden tables to be cleared of weapons and maps. He pulled a chair from the dais and sat. He looked at the local scholars, pointed to the empty seats opposite him, and waited. The silence was not the silence of fear, but of profound confusion. One by one, the elders rose and approached, their movements slow and measured. The smell of cedar and dried ink replaced the metallic tang of the battlefield. Alexander leaned forward, his focus entirely on the men who held the knowledge of this land. And for the first time in 10 years, he let his guard drop. Alexander unrolled the Greek parchment, the edges brittle from the desert heat. Opposite him, a local physician placed a long, palm-leaf manuscript on the table. It was the Sushruta Samhita. Alexander leaned in, his shadow stretching across the text. He pointed to a detailed diagram of a surgical instrument. The physician nodded, then traced a line on his own scroll, revealing a nearly identical technique for closing a deep wound. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the scratching of a reed pen against paper. They compared the anatomy of the human limb, pointing to nerves and vessels mapped out in 2 different languages. Alexander watched the physician demonstrate the stitching of a skin graft, his eyes tracking the needle with absolute focus. He reached out and touched the ink on the page, feeling the texture of the knowledge. It was not a conquest of land, but a merging of minds. The Greek geometry of the body aligned with the Indian understanding of physical trauma. They turned the pages together, ignoring the guards at the door and the empire outside. The distance between the Mediterranean and the Ganges vanished in the space between 2 open books. Alexander stepped from the palace into the bright, harsh glare of the midday sun. His soldiers waited in the courtyard, their hands calloused from years of gripping spear shafts. He did not speak of glory or further battle. He walked to the center of the formation, grabbed a discarded javelin, and drove the point into the hard earth. He then signaled to his engineers. Within minutes, the sound of metal against stone changed. The rhythmic clatter of marching boots was replaced by the heavy thud of pickaxes and the scrape of shovels against the ground. Veterans who had spent a decade breaking lines of infantry now knelt to break rock. They pulled up the old, uneven paths and began laying the foundations of a massive road network. The spears were stacked in piles, abandoned in favor of measuring rods and heavy iron hammers. Alexander walked the length of the growing track, watching as the dust of the road mingled with the sweat of men who were no longer conquerors, but builders. They worked in silence, their eyes fixed on the horizon, where the road cut a straight line toward the limits of the known world. The empire was no longer a moving front of steel. It was becoming a permanent web of stone and commerce. The work of the spear had ended, but the work of the pen had only just begun. Alexander's surveyors moved in teams, carrying long measuring chains and ink-stained rolls of papyrus. They descended into the river valleys, their boots sinking into the silt of the monsoon-fed banks. One team reached a point where the river had burst its banks, swallowing the path they intended to chart. They halted, debating the angle of the current against the sun. The lead engineer knelt, adjusted his astrolabe, and recalculated the curve of the water against the distant mountain peaks. He marked the shift on his parchment with a steady, deliberate hand. Every bend of the Ganges, every hidden tributary, and every elevation change was recorded with clinical precision. They mapped the world as they found it, stripping away the mystery of the landscape. As the sun dipped low, the maps grew dense with lines, names, and distances. These were not just drawings. They were the new skeleton of the empire, a permanent record of the terrain that would survive long after the armies had moved on. By nightfall, the vast, uncharted wilderness of the East had been transformed into a series of measured coordinates, neatly captured on vellum, ready to guide those who would follow in their footsteps. The rhythm of the camp changed with the arrival of the riders. They did not come with the steady gait of surveyors, but with the frantic speed of men who had ridden horses to exhaustion. They brought no maps. They brought scrolls sealed with the wax of the West. Alexander took the first, his thumb breaking the seal as he stood in the center of his unfinished road. The news was not of geography, but of rot. Governors in the Mediterranean were acting as kings, ignoring decrees and seizing local treasuries. The reports detailed riots in the streets of Pella and open defiance in the garrisons. Alexander read the accounts by the light of a dying torch. The distance between his position and his capital had become an unbridgeable gulf. Every mile of new road he built felt increasingly like a tether to a ghost. The messengers waited, their heads bowed, as the silence stretched across the camp. He looked back at his maps, the precise, ink-drawn lines of a cohesive empire, and then at the reports of chaos. The reality of the West was bleeding into the East. The unity he had forged in fire was fraying at the edges. He folded the parchment, the paper crisp and sharp in his grip, and turned his back on the horizon. The journey back ended in the sweltering heat of Babylon. The air inside the palace was stagnant, trapped by thick stone walls that held the day's heat long into the night. Alexander entered the inner chambers, his stride heavy, the familiar pulse of command replaced by a sudden, jarring chill that radiated from his bones. He reached for the edge of the table to steady himself, but his grip lacked strength. The fever arrived not as a slow decline, but as an immediate, consuming fire. He collapsed onto the low bed, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. The servants moved in the shadows, their footsteps muffled by rugs. But he heard nothing but the roaring in his own ears. He reached out, fingers brushing the cool stone of the floor, searching for the stability that had defined his life. It was gone. The man who had crossed the world, who had dictated the movement of armies and the fate of cities, was now anchored to a single room. Outside, the city of Babylon continued its life, indifferent to the silent war being fought within the walls. He stared at the ceiling, his vision darkening at the edges. As the fever stripped away the strength of a decade in a matter of hours, the conquest had stopped. The chamber grew crowded, not with servants, but with men of war. They stepped over the threshold, their boots clicking against the marble floor with a sound that seemed too loud in the stillness. Alexander lay on the bed, his chest rising and falling with increasing difficulty, his eyes tracing the patterns on the ceiling. He was no longer the center of gravity. His generals stood in a loose circle, their hands resting on the hilts of their weapons, their gazes darting away from the bed and toward the large map spread across the central table. There was no weeping. There was only the sound of heavy, measured breathing and the friction of parchment as fingers traced the borders of provinces. One general leaned forward, his finger hovering over the lands of the east, calculating the distance to the next garrison. Another moved to the window, watching the city below, already assessing the strength of the walls he intended to claim. They spoke in low, clipped tones, their voices devoid of grief, replaced by the cold, analytical language of inheritance. Alexander's hand twitched against the linens, a final, futile gesture, but none noticed. The room had become a war council. They were no longer waiting for orders. They were waiting for the end of the man who had given them the world, so they could begin the work of taking it apart. The final breath came as a shallow rattle, then silence. The room seemed to contract. One general turned from the map, his hand gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. He did not look at the bed. He looked at the door. The tension that had been held in check snapped instantly. Chairs scraped against the stone as men rushed to the exits. There was no ritual, no final salute. The unity of the campaign dissolved in the space of a single heartbeat. Messengers were dispatched before the body was cold, carrying orders that contradicted one another, carving the map into competing claims. The phalanx, the cavalry, the engineers all were now pawns in a new internal war. In the outer provinces, governors stopped sending gold to Babylon. They fortified their gates and turned their backs on the center. The vast, interconnected web of infrastructure, the roads, the trade routes, all began to fray. The dream of a single, world-spanning crown shattered into a dozen jagged pieces. Each piece became a new, smaller conflict. The soldiers who had marched for years toward the horizon now found themselves ordered to march against each other. The empire, built over a decade of motion, collapsed in a single night of frantic, desperate ambition. The political maps returned to their former shapes, but the stone remained. In the remote mountain valleys and trade centers, the chisels did not stop. Local artisans, long influenced by the influx of new techniques, continued their work. They approached their blocks of marble with a different intent. They began to carve the features of the Buddha. The result was a haunting shift in form. The heavy, meditative lids took on a defined, structured grace. The flowing lines of the hair mirrored the precision of Greek sculptural traditions. The statues looked out over the changing landscape with a calm that defied the surrounding cycle of conquest and collapse. It was a fusion etched in stone. Travelers passing through these regions stopped to touch the faces of these figures, noticing the convergence of two distinct worlds in a single profile. This was not a military victory. It was a permanent alteration of the human landscape. These monuments stood as silent witnesses to a decade of travel that had permanently bridged the distance between the Ganges and the Mediterranean. The empires fell, the borders moved, but the fusion of these two artistic spirits survived, locked into the rock, unmoved by the frantic shifting of power in the capitals. The borders that had once been pushed to the horizon retreated with the same speed they had been conquered. Kings reclaimed their ancestral lands, and the lines on the maps reverted to their ancient, jagged configurations. Yet, while the political structures dissolved, the intellectual currents refused to recede. Scrolls, once held in private libraries, began to move across the new frontiers. Physicians in the Nile Delta opened texts that originated near the Ganges, comparing diagrams of the human body with their own long-held traditions. The exchange became a quiet, relentless tide. It did not require a king to authorize it, or a phalanx to guard it. It moved through the hands of traders, scholars, and pilgrims who ignored the newly erected customs posts. Methods for treating injury, observations of the stars, and the logic of geometry crossed the deserts and the seas. This was the true legacy of the campaign, one that functioned outside the reach of any crown. The knowledge grew, refined by the synthesis of two distinct worlds. It flowed from the east to the west, weaving a connection that would outlast every border and every regime. The map was no longer a record of conquest, but a pathway for a civilization that had learned to share its most vital discoveries. The Hyphasis continues to carve its path through the silt and stone, moving toward a future that no single ambition could ever dictate. It flows with the same indifference today as it did when thousands stood upon its muddy banks, waiting for a command that would change the world. That moment of hesitation at the river's edge remains the anchor point of the entire journey. Alexander sought to build a crown that would unite the earth, but the reality left behind was something far more durable. It was not a throne, but a bridge, a connection forged in the heat of movement, in the exchange of tools, and in the collision of distant ideas. The empire fractured, the armies dispersed, and the names of the victors faded into the dry annals of history. Yet, the path remains. The divide between civilizations, once thought impassable, was bridged by the sheer force of a single decade. The river flows on, ignoring the shifting borders and the rise and fall of regimes. It marks the boundary where the greatest reach of human ambition met the reality of the earth. History settled into the quiet, steady rhythm of the water, leaving behind a world permanently altered by the attempt to conquer it.